Hello and welcome. The stability of the modern Russian state is showing deep and alarming fractures. For years, Western journalists and military analysts have detailed the mounting pressures on the nation, from a faltering economy to growing civil unrest. However, the narrative within Russia has been tightly controlled, a constant stream of state-sponsored optimism designed to mask any sign of weakness. That monolithic facade is now beginning to crack. In an unprecedented turn, the alarm bells are no longer ringing just from the outside. They are now sounding from within the very circles of power that have long sought to silence them. Russian experts, some with direct ties to the Kremlin, are beginning to speak openly about the unthinkable, the potential for civil war, a total breakdown of the political system, and widespread chaos engulfing the world's largest nation. These are not the hyperbolic predictions of foreign adversaries, but the grim assessments of those who have an inside view of the country's deteriorating condition. It suggests that the nation may have reached a tipping point where the carefully constructed propaganda can no longer contain the weight of the country's myriad problems. One of the most striking of these new candid assessments comes from Alexander Karachev, who serves as the head of the Presidential Directorate for Monitoring and Analyzing Social Processes. In a recent article for the Russian journal State, Karachev laid out 5 critical challenges that he believes are pushing Russia toward a catastrophic failure. His analysis, while colored by a distinct Kremlin ideological perspective, nevertheless paints a stark picture of a nation in peril. As we delve into these 5 challenges and a crucial 6th one he fails to mention, a portrait emerges of a country whose collapse may not be imminent, but has, in fact, already begun. The first great crisis, as identified by Karachev, is a demographic spiral. Russia, currently the 9th most populous country with nearly 144 million people, is facing the prospect of a steady and irreversible decline. Karachev, in line with official Kremlin ideology, attributes this to what he calls a globalist experiment, a virus affecting thinking that promotes child-free lifestyles and non-traditional family structures. He points to women in major Chinese cities as an example, claiming they prioritize careers over families, often having only one child late in life without a partner. He extends this argument to blame the LGBTQ community and a desire for child-free living for what he terms the destruction of our people. His proposed solution involves a state-sponsored campaign to make large families fashionable again, even suggesting that films should be produced featuring families with 3 or more children to inspire a new wave of procreation. However, the reality of Russia's demographic crisis has far deeper and more brutal roots than a supposed ideological virus. The most immediate factor is the staggering human cost of the war in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of men, many of them young and in their prime, have been lost on the battlefield. These are men who would have otherwise built families, contributed to the economy, and formed the bedrock of future generations. Hundreds of thousands more have returned with life-altering injuries, placing an immense and unsustainable strain on the nation's already fragile healthcare and social support systems. Beyond the battlefield, an estimated 1 million Russians have fled the country since the war began. They left not because of a shifting ideology, but out of protest, fear for their lives, and a profound sense of hopelessness about their nation's future. This exodus represents a massive brain drain of educated and able-bodied citizens. The official data confirms this grim picture. In 2024, Russia recorded just 1.22 million births, the lowest figure since the economic turmoil of 1999. Projections indicate that this number will continue to fall by 3 to 5% annually until at least 2030. Compounding this is the collapse of another critical demographic pillar, immigration. For 3 decades, Russia relied on immigrants, primarily from Central Asian nations, to offset its natural population decline. But with the economy in tatters, rampant inflation, and the nation increasingly isolated on the world stage, Russia is no longer an attractive destination for those seeking a better life. The fundamental issues driving people away and discouraging new births are war, economic instability, and political repression, not a lack of family-focused films. The second challenge Karachev highlights is what he terms the loss of sovereignty. In a paradoxical argument, he claims that the war in Ukraine has, in fact, served as a cleansing process that has saved Russia's sovereignty. He argues that before the invasion, the Russian elite was entirely Western-oriented, educating their children abroad and planning retirements on the Côte d'Azur or in Montenegro. According to him, this brain drain, where 70% of graduates from top physics and mathematics schools left the country, would have eventually hollowed out Russia's economic and technological potential. The war, in his view, has forced a rejection of globalization and restored a sense of national pride. His solution is to double down on this trend by implementing widespread patriotic education in schools to indoctrinate younger generations with Kremlin-approved values. Yet once again, the reality on the ground points to a completely opposite trend. While Khrushchev worries about a theoretical loss of sovereignty to globalism, a far more tangible threat is emerging from within Russia's own borders. The Kremlin's grip on its vast and diverse federation is weakening, and whispers of separatism are growing louder in various regions, particularly those with large indigenous populations who have long felt exploited by Moscow. In republics like Sakha, a vast resource-rich territory in Siberia, and Ingushetia in the North Caucasus, there is growing resentment toward the central government. Partisan groups, local militias, and even some elected officials are beginning to call for a level of autonomy not seen since the chaotic dissolution of the Soviet Union. The war has only intensified these feelings, as many non-ethnic Russians from these regions feel they are being used as cannon fodder in a conflict that serves only the interests of the Moscow elite. The real threat to Russia's sovereignty today is not from without, but from within, as the Federation itself begins to fray at the seams. This internal fragmentation leads directly to Khrushchev's third identified crisis, the erosion of public trust in the government. Before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, despite his authoritarian methods, enjoyed a significant degree of popular support. For many Russians, he represented stability and a return to national pride after the turbulent 1990s. But the war has irrevocably shattered that image. While draconian laws against dissent make open criticism a perilous act, the signs of a deep and growing disillusionment are unmistakable. The outpouring of grief and defiance at the funeral of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, where thousands lined the streets in a silent protest, was a powerful testament to the shifting public mood. Across the country, from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, protests against the war and the government continue to erupt, becoming more intense as the human and economic costs mount. The anger is increasingly directed at Putin himself, along with the circle of elites who perpetuate the conflict. This sentiment is backed by hard data. A recent poll by the independent Levada Center found that a commanding majority of Russians, 66%, now believe the time has come for peaceful negotiations and a ceasefire. Only a small minority of 27% felt the fighting should continue. The poll also revealed the deep personal impact of the war, with respondents citing the loss of loved ones, fractured family relationships, and severe financial hardship. A leader, even a dictator, cannot rule by force alone. They require at least a passive consent from the populace. Putin is rapidly losing that consent, and his image as an infallible leader has been replaced by that of a weak, isolated figurehead presiding over a national tragedy. Khrushchev's proposed solution, a meritocratic system where leaders are chosen for their qualifications, sounds reasonable in theory, but it is a fantasy in modern Russia, where loyalty to one man, Vladimir Putin, is the only currency that matters. The fourth crisis Khrushchev outlines is perhaps the most abstract, which he labels the dehumanization and transhumanism of the Russian people. He laments that too many Russians, particularly the youth, are adopting what the Kremlin views as decadent, capitalist Western lifestyles. He sees a generation obsessed with technology, retreating into the virtual world of the internet for comfort and convenience rather than contributing actively to society. "We need patriots," he writes, "not couch potatoes, but active people ready to take responsibility for themselves, their families, and their country." His solution, once again, is education, a mission to instill traditional values like patriotism, teamwork, and moral norms into the next generation. This concern reveals the Kremlin's fundamental misunderstanding of the modern world. The trends Khrushchev fears are not unique to Russia. They are global shifts driven by technology and cultural exchange. Younger generations everywhere are growing up with different values and perspectives than their parents. While other nations grapple with how to embrace this change and learn from new generations, Russia's response is to attempt to force its youth into a rigid, state-approved mold. This strategy is not only likely to fail, but it is also prone to backfire spectacularly. The more the Kremlin tries to control and coerce its young people, the more it pushes them toward rebellion or, more likely, flight. By trying to create a generation of robotic patriots, the state is inadvertently encouraging the very brain drain and depopulation that Khrushchev identified as the nation's first major crisis. This brings us to the fifth and most chilling of Khrushchev's predictions, the very real possibility of a full-scale civil war. The fact that a Kremlin-affiliated sociologist can openly discuss such a scenario in a state-adjacent journal is a stunning admission of how dire the situation has become. Just a few years ago, the idea would have been dismissed as unthinkable propaganda. Today, it is a sober acknowledgement of the deep and violent divisions tearing Russian society apart. The tensions are simmering everywhere, the rumblings of separatist movements in the ethnic republics, the angry anti-war protests in major cities, and the activities of partisan militias actively working against the regime are all indicators of a society at its breaking point. The Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center has outlined several plausible scenarios for how a civil war could erupt. Perhaps in Chechnya, the death of its volatile leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, could trigger a brutal power struggle that spirals into a third Chechen war. Perhaps in Tatarstan, protests against the recruitment of Tatars for the war in Ukraine and the suppression of their cultural identity could be met with a violent crackdown from Moscow, sparking a broader anti-colonial uprising. Or perhaps in Sakha, unemployed local men could seize control of the hydrocarbon infrastructure that enriches Moscow while their own region remains impoverished, demanding the sovereignty they were promised in the 1990s. Any of these events, or countless others, could be the spark that ignites the tinderbox of Russian resentment, leading to the collapse of the Putin regime and a violent redrawing of the map of the Russian Federation. Finally, there is the one crisis Khrushchev failed to mention, yet it is the one that underpins all the others: the catastrophic state of the Russian economy. Money, or the lack of it, is the root of nearly all national problems, and the Kremlin is rapidly losing its financial footing. A recent report from the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine, released on November 5th, detailed the extent of the economic decay. According to their assessment, nearly 40% of all Russian enterprises are now facing significant payment delays, a massive jump from 25% just 1 year ago. Demand for goods and services has plummeted for 34% of businesses, and 32% are grappling with critical liquidity shortages. Logistical problems are rampant, with 15% of companies reporting severe disruptions to their supply chains. In response, Russian businesses have entered what the report calls survival mode. 68% are slashing expenses, from administrative costs to service expenditures, just to stay afloat. Another 15% have completely suspended all plans for investment and expansion. Business leaders across the country describe the situation as difficult and uncertain, with little hope for improvement on the horizon. This is the grim economic reality that fuels the social unrest, the demographic decline, and the political fragility. The country is not just fighting a war abroad, it is fighting a losing battle against economic collapse at home. Taken together, these crises paint a picture of a nation that is not merely on the brink of collapse, but is already in the process of disintegrating. The government appears paralyzed, its economy is caught in a death spiral, and its people are bearing the terrible cost of decisions made far beyond their control. The fall of Russia is no longer a question of if, but how. The only question that remains is what will be the final trigger: a civil war, the end of the conflict in Ukraine, or the overthrow of the Putin government that marks the end of this chapter and the beginning of a new, uncertain, and undoubtedly turbulent future.